Headless is really important in that it helps enforce those abstractions. Many applications are built with like a UI in mind and everything kind of propagates downwards. So if you have a headless system, you're extremely rigorous about maintaining those abstractions. For example, Medplum is like really aggressively headless. If you think of the functionality that we provide, there's only a very small sliver that cannot be done via API or automation, including things like adding identity providers to the system or like inviting users with specific access policies.
Welcome to Concept to Care, where we hear candid stories of success and failure, discuss strategy, and dive into the details that offer advice on what to do and what not to do in health tech.
Whether you're a seasoned pro, growing your career, or just starting out, our aim for this podcast is to be relevant, real world, and tactical. We're dedicated to not only entertaining you all, but also empowering you with actionable insights that can be applied beyond the podcast, one concept at a time.
This is Angela.
And this is Omar.
Welcome to Concept to Care. Hello, welcome to Concept to Care. Today, we are thrilled to have Reshma Khilnani, CEO and co-founder of Medplum, joining us. Medplum is a headless open source platform designed to revolutionize healthcare software, and it does it by offering unparalleled flexibility and interoperability. We are especially excited about this episode because Medplum has been a guest favorite. In this episode, Reshma takes us behind the scenes of building Medplum, and she shares insights on why traditional EMRs fall short. She talks about the benefits of a headless architecture and how open source is reshaping healthcare technology. We're also going to dive into Medplum's engineering-led culture, their innovative approach to product development, and the unique challenges of their go-to-market strategy. I really love this episode because Medplum is empowering tech-enabled healthcare services to deliver more integrated care. If you're building in health tech or want to learn more about EMRs, this is a great episode. Enjoy.
Reshma, welcome to the show.
Omar, Angela, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. We are excited to talk to you. You've been mentioned and spotlighted a few times on this podcast. It's been very unintentional, which may speak to the nature of how great you and the team at Medplum are. Well, let's start this off. Just tell the audience about yourself.
Sure thing. Well, first of all, both of you, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's great to be here. I'm Reshma Khilnani, co-founder and CEO of Medplum. We help people make custom medical apps. And by, history, I've had a crossover career, big tech, Facebook, Microsoft, I guess now Meta. And then about 10 years ago, transitioned to be a healthcare software professional, founded a company called MedXT, which was acquired by Box. We're the same team at Medplum who is building that, built a few systems in between, and now building Medplum, which is open source technology platform.
We've heard so much about Medplum. We'd love it if you could go into the initial vision and how did it evolve as a product?
Happy to. So, Medplum is really born out of a need. Having been a developer in the healthcare software space over the years, you find yourself doing the same thing again and again. When we built our first startup, we built a certain system, MedXT. We actually rebuilt that same system several times, including some of the team members at Medplum were on the One Medical team as well. So similar patterns seen again and again when developing applications. And when you're a developer, you think about that a certain way. You use open source tools, for example, to reduce the repetitive nature of building the same application again and again. And that's exactly what inspired Medplum. We don't want to do the same thing over and over again. We want to show how to do it the right way, incorporate the learnings that we've had over having done it a few times. In terms of evolution, software products do require constant maintenance. They're always evolving. If you go to our Medplum repository on GitHub, github.com, Medplum/Medplum, you'll see that we are adding to it constantly, us and community members, and it is driven by people encountering specific issues in the wild when they're doing their implementation. So that's a lot of where the evolution comes from, organic.
Reshma, it's maybe not a secret and, maybe just my opinion, but it seems like everyone hates their EMR. Most people have not thought about why. And I think you have a really great way of articulating this. Can you speak to why EMRs are not an appropriate tool for or a full stack application for healthcare?
So I think that, electronic medical records, medical systems of different kinds, like if you think of provider order entry tools or laboratory information systems, they've all accumulated a ton of functionality over time. Due to changes in the regulations, the increasingly complex and technical natures of workflows, you start adding more and more to applications like EMRs, and they become at some point unwieldy. Like they're like a pincushion full of functionality. If you compare to like what you might see in other industries, what you see in an EMR might be like 4 or 5 different apps or an app suite in another industry. So this is not that inherently this category of software has like a flaw. It's more that it's just gotten overloaded. And so that is origin of a lot of the frustration that people experience with their EMRs. And I think that is part of the inspiration behind Medplum. We think that like decomposing applications into like functional units that are fit for purpose, that are directed, and that are like really ergonomic is part of what is going to delight users and, reduce their burden over time. So that's what we really hope for.
I've never heard someone describe software as ergonomic. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Well, in Medplum, we help people make custom medical apps. And one of the top goals that they have is that people don't have to type as much, don't have to dictate as much, don't have to click as much. That's a big win for a provider who exists in helping people in a face-to-face interaction. Like, you don't really want them to have a lot of touch points with their software. You want it to feel natural. And so, yeah, that's a big draw. I think if something is super ergonomic, it's not hurting your wrists, it's not like disrupting your day, it's something that is really helping you versus hindering you.
Reshma, I would love for you to help us understand the modern healthcare landscape. And if you could talk through some of the problems that you identify along the landscape, I think that'd be really helpful.
So I think there are many problems in healthcare applications in general, and specific ones each have their own set of like quirks. But at a high level, one of the fundamental issues with a lot of healthcare systems and healthcare IT is that all of the abstraction, there's no sense of abstraction. Everything is commingled. Things like the data, the business logic, the clinical logic, the compliance, the identities, the user interface, they're all commingled and they're kind of smashed together as part of many applications. And so if, for example, you wanted to like just replace the clinical logic or just like enhance the compliance, you have to do, maybe I'll use the medical analogy, a really like open heart surgery on the application. That is in general hard, problematic, and high risk. So one of the, ways that we think about it is crystallizing each layer into its own kind of piece. So the data management is done separately from the access controls, which is done separately from the clinical logic and separately from the user interface. And so if you just want to swap out something on the user interface or just want to upgrade the identity system, for example, you could do so. And I think one of, the problems with the commingling can be really like helped by providing those right abstractions. So it's a very developer-centric perspective. I wouldn't say that like, there's problems across the board. For a lot of medical systems, the data in them are not semantically comparable across applications, for example. But I think this abstraction one is very fundamental and one we experience day to day.
Medplum is often referred to, or maybe even can be classified as a headless open source platform, right? And that's fair to say. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to, one, the benefits of a headless architecture, and two, why might someone want an open source platform to build on, especially in healthcare?
I mean, headless is really important in that it helps enforce those abstractions. Many applications are built with like a UI in mind and everything kind of propagates downwards. So if you have a headless system, you're extremely rigorous about maintaining those abstractions. For example, Medplum is like really aggressively headless. If you think of the functionality that we provide, there's only a very small sliver that cannot be done via API or automation, including things like adding identity providers to the system or like inviting users with specific access policies. Like those type of very specific functions we support in a headless manner. And that's to, allow change management to happen effectively at all layers of the system. So the user interface can be changed, the identities can be changed. So it's really in service of that composability that application developers and eventually like providers, staff members, and other stakeholders need to build up that experience that is really going to work for them. So we see that as super important. That's why headless matters to us. If we're really successful, there will actually be less UI rather than more. And that will be a benefit for people because they'll just have like less things to navigate. So open source relates directly to that as well. So there's a lot of, if you really need to program something and you really need to make it work, like open source is an incredible tool because you won't reach the end of the road. You can like see how things work and push through many hard issues. I see this at firsthand in like non-medical systems, things like Postgres or, Kafka. Like these type of systems are incredibly useful in engineering in general. And we're trying to bring that same process and same thought pattern to healthcare applications.
I love that you have built Medplum from a 0 to 1. I think that, it's incredibly admirable. We would love to hear some of the biggest challenges that you've faced in the build of the company and, how you were able to overcome such challenges.
So, like I mentioned, maybe at the top of the show in the background, we've built Medplum 0 to 1, but it is inspired by the previous applications that we have built in the past. And it's really like maybe even a third or fourth generation of a system that we've seen the patterns for again and again. And this time we're, open sourcing it and we're documenting it with an incredible zeal. Like we're really trying to document to the extreme. And part of the big challenge of 0 to 1 is identifying the use cases and like how people will use it and then trying to encourage people to use it. And we had the benefits of having gone through that process a few times before. So that is part of what's helped us this time around. But the biggest challenges are always circle around the developer, like engaging them, finding them, and then convincing them that this is like a reasonable solution to solve those thorny problems that we talked about, building that software that's less hateable than previous versions.
Do you remember the moment that you understood that you had product market fit?
I think that product market fit, is on a continuum and we are always trying to push forward. I think one of the things that we think of as a really big milestone is when we started to get like meaningful contributions from those who are not Medplum employees. And for us, that's a sign that someone is using this in production. And you can just tell by the nature of what fixes they're pushing to Medplum that, they're doing something that's really meaningful. For example, this query is running slow. You must have millions of patients if that type of query is running slow. So that is a tell for our community. And we really value the contributors and those who are like really building on the system every day. And they're for us the strongest signal of any kind of product market fit, engagement, and we are always working to like try and serve them as well as we can.
I want to switch gears here for a little bit. I want to talk about product development and some of the go-to-market motions at Medplum. Mm-hmm. Tell us a bit more about the team at Medplum and how you're building product. Healthcare uses product managers to often communicate how healthcare does business. And, we're talking about a developer product, but developers are never really, I wouldn't say never, but they're not normally super close to the business in a way we'd like to. So what does the team look like and how do you guys prioritize feature development at Medplum?
That is a good question. And I mean, our team really mirrors our customer set to date. So We are pretty much all engineers. We come in two flavors. Infrastructure engineers who work on the core product and kind of a forward deployed engineers who work with customers. So those are the two kind of categories. I guess there's me, and I am an engineer by training, but hands-on keyboard are maybe more limited at this time in my life. But how we prioritize product development is really informed by those forward deployed folks who are working directly with the customers. We open up a shared Slack channel, and we also have a Discord group with people in it who are literally asking questions. And it's a unique skill. It's very product-like skill to listen to what they're asking, try and reverse engineer what they're doing, and think about how that would drive the requirements. It can be as specific as we see this weird encoding when this crosses the wire, down to, I need to implement something very business specific, like this value-based care payment scheme. And we have to trace that back to the technical requirements. So it's more of a practice than a formula or anything like that. But it is really informed by up close touch points with the customer. And I think like any, I worked in product in other organizations as well. And a lot of touch points in customer success or those type of functions where you're facing the customers, those are just really ripe for finding out the insights that people need in order to advance their business and advance their use case. But it's always a work in progress. I mean, healthcare is it's got depth in so many axes. Like you mentioned, the business requirements, not only does the engineer, sometimes even product or business that almost nobody can see through end to end in an organization, that happens. I don't know if that you have that experience as well, but
I wanted to ask two follow-up questions. I'll go one at a time. So it seems like you don't have a formal account management function, customer success function. It kind of, because it's a developer product and it's developer led, you have this system in place to kind of get those customer requirements, and you sit really closely with the customer. Talk to us about what that looks like in practice, how the details. Yeah.
Totally. So, I mean, maybe account management is the term. We have that as a function at Medplum. My co-founder, Rahul Agarwal, he comes from Palantir, so he's really the expert on how to make this work. But it's a combination of hands-on implementation experience and, first-party engagement with the customers listening. And then distilling that into requirements and kind of seeing the common thread throughout multiple customers. So we also have good traffic on our repository, people filing issues, we run a big SaaS offering. So you can see request patterns and traffic. So these are all really rich sources. And our account management is driven by those touch points. We also do, have customers who have a business relationship with, and they have specific objectives that they want to meet. Sometimes they're business objectives. So that's often another, source of intel into what to build and how to build it.
I read a tweet this morning, shout out Nikhil from Out of Pocket, but he had mentioned Palantir's culture and how they've done such a great job, building these or creating this function around individuals who are on site with the customer, and how the words coming from those individuals are pretty much gospel, right? That is very much how you solve problems for customers, is you kind of embed yourself in that same way. So kudos to you guys for, bringing in some Palantir talent. My second follow-up question to that was, you get a lot of inbound, you said you have a lot of activity on the community, right? How do you prioritize specifically there? How do you decide what gets done next? Because constraint is always engineers.
This is always a work in progress, how to prioritize the customer requests. I think there's a few techniques that we like to employ. One is that we have a public backlog, and there's people who can vote with their feet and really write what they'd like to see. And why. And we take That seriously, we're not, making this up in that respect. There's a lot of great open source companies. I think PostHog, Supabase, like these type of companies really pioneer how to do that. And we love to use them as a reference example on what to do. With regards to healthcare itself, we have a lot of benefits in that there's a ton of bright lines that healthcare provides. HIPAA, SOC 2, ONC certification. You need to support these specific, NCQA or like the government outlines. And so that's also a really great framework with which to think about the requirements. We're very into the healthcare standards. So we're, heavy users of the common ontologies, like SNOMED, et cetera. FHIR, HL7v2, DICOM. We are very well versed in all of these standards and the dialects that come from peer systems. Often people just want things to work. Like I want to connect system A to system B. So, or I want to get this workflow done. So that's also kind of a lens with which to think about prioritizing. Like if we think about tracing the path of where people want to go, that's part of what we offer. I think our public roadmap, Omar, is maybe something to think about. If you wanted to weigh in ever on something that you think we should be doing, I would welcome that.
I think we're gonna probably take some of these and publish them in the show notes, and I'll take a look. We're not using it, but maybe I just throw some opinions in there.
It's like podcast feedback probably is similar to people, tweeting at you or writing in.
Yeah, for sure. I think our audience probably has a lot to say.
Reshma, one thing that I would love to understand is that you are building a very technical product. And so I'm sure your go-to-market is a little bit different than typical off-the-shelf healthcare software. Could you explain a little bit about who you're selling to? How do you sell to them? How do you get it in the hands of the decision makers? How do you close deals? Things like that?
Good question, Angela. And the first thing I'll mention is we don't make it up. We are open source company. And so we are also taking cues from the open source greats who are like, Databricks, Confluent. These are enterprise software companies who use a developer first sales motion. So we are riffing off of their leadership and not, making things up de novo. But the way it works is that we have a few channels. We have our Docker downloads, for example, our Discord open source community, our GitHub issues, our SaaS product. And people are constantly signing up and coming through those channels. We ask them if they would like to see a demo of the commercial offering and, move them through that way. There's a lot of things that are kind of a natural business arrangement for people to have with Medplum. For example, we have integrations with other software, and you don't have to license it yourself, or you could just, buy a package and get those integrations. Or you want a certain kind of certification. That's like a natural touch point. But what we rely on, and this is common across a lot of open source companies, is that actually before the sales process, people are building and they're engaging the leadership at their organization, kind of making the case internally, and they come to us later in the process. So it does feel very different from something like a full stack SaaS solution where you go find the business stakeholder and present to them. There's kind of a big triangle of internal stakeholders, kind of the buyer, and us as a technology provider. So I'm not sure if that helps, Angela, but really acquiring across the channels and engaging in community is part of what we see as really important.
And I think super strong word of mouth for you all.
Word of code.
I love that. I've never heard that one before. Word of code. In to double click on just like awareness, like is there any levers that you guys pull to drive awareness outside of the organic space?
That's also a work in progress, but as other open source platforms have done, community events, like really having a physical presence where people can meet and convene, those type of things are generally really effective. I think you need to find out where other developers are. So that is a thing. But part of growing awareness is having a presence there and having like a name to a face type of thing. We also encourage those who are developing on the platform to share their solutions and, really, I don't know, make videos or show screenshots, and people generally do. And that's another way to, I guess that's maybe more on the organic side, but as we mature, as time progresses, we'll do more of that traditional stuff. But at present, we're really focused on the organic channels and working with our community and in community with our customers.
Makes sense. And then to double click further on the, how does one go from community to enterprise? You mentioned integrations. Is it specific features or is it usage? Like what's the thing that I want or need before I become an enterprise customer?
Sometimes it's as simple as compliance. I want to use your certification, or I need to have a hosted version that's already SOC 2 Type 2 compliant. That type of thing is a pretty bright line. Second is really, connectivity to things like exchanges or lab ordering, medications, those type of use cases, having those like integrated. You don't have to worry about it as an app developer. You can just focus on your business logic. That type of thing is a good touch point. I think that there's also like more advanced scenarios. For example, for an enterprise buyer, they often want to have a system that's independent of Azure, GCP, and AWS. They want to have like a sovereign solution. And so, having a commercial agreement with a vendor who could potentially operate across those is something that's useful to the enterprise, or they want high scale performance guarantees, support this many transactions or this type of workloads. So those are typically the angles. Again, we're not making this one up. Confluent, Databricks, they also have a very analogous kind of transition into the offering. But I'll make this clear. Like we encourage every healthcare dev to try out Medplum. Like, please go nuts. Like, we really think that it's important that we have an offering for everybody, to try and to use if it's useful for you.
Okay, so Reshma, one of the things that we learned from you is that Medplum is 100% engineering. There's no product people. And so would love your perspective on the role of product when using a platform like Medplum. Do you feel like they're needed and what value do they bring?
Product, it plays a really critical role in these healthcare organizations. In fact, it's almost product plus a little bit of subject matter expert that you really need to deliver the solutions well. And we see it as a big sign of success. A strong product leadership will really be helpful in implementation when we work with customers, because that's often, a big aspect of the implementation. Like, to have a well-controlled slice of what you want to build versus building everything is just incredibly helpful. So I'd say the role of product that we see in a modern healthcare organization is, subject matter expertise, ability to navigate the complex requirements, and 2, what to build, but also what not to build. Because having that focus is what will really, deliver that ergonomic, quickly delivered, and not spiraling application implementation.
One of the things that we've seen is that product can have a variety of different roles and responsibilities within an organization. And so do you have guidance in terms of training to be a successful product person?
That's a really good question, Angela. And I think that it's very useful for those in product to have some base level of technical education on like how applications are built. I think one of the things that we think is useful to do is often make a hello world application that kind of does something very basic to, for example, display a patient message or something like that, to get a sense of what your engineering team is experiencing day to day. Often that just hello world can show, how does the authentication system work? Like, not everyone can have the same permissions. We need to make sure we store the diffs on the data, like those basic things which we have to obsess about on the engineering side that often are completely, brushed under in a implementation. But are critical to make things work well. So I think that developing that or trying that out as a group, if there's like a group training, we also, welcome folks to read our documentation. And we think that it has a very technical lens and could provide a precursor to that type of exercise.
Let's talk about interoperability and APIs. So given Medplum's focus on healthcare interoperability, what are some of the biggest barriers to achieving seamless data exchange in health tech, and how does Medplum address them?
Wow, this is a big and complex problem. So I'm going to answer it from the perspective of, my limited vantage point. I think there's many experts who I think you've had on and will bring on this space. But I do have, I think, a unique take in the sense that those who are using Medplum are often authors of, healthcare data. They're not just like slurping it in from another system and that is unique in many ways. We want customers and community members to create data that is like semantically comparable across implementations. For example, if you have Clinic 1 and Clinic 2, what I've seen in practice, looking at other systems, ETLing them and massaging the data and looking at it, is sometimes you can't even compare the data across. So what we see as part of our role is helping people create that super standards compliant data so that Clinic 1 and Clinic 2 would have data that is actually comparable, which means standards compliant, tagged with the right ontologies, has the right provenance, knows where it came from, all that stuff. I think there's a lot of barriers to getting the interop to work well. Some of them are a lot of legacy systems were never intended to be connected to, or for whatever reason, people don't want to connect them. I think one of the things that is rare about healthcare is that your EHR is mandated to have an interface if you want to be compliant. And you haven't ever seen that in other industries, right? It's not like this company 1 and company 2 have to share their customer list. They don't. So it is kind of novel. I think the barriers are maybe often too big scope to discuss from a Medplum perspective. But one thing that I'll say philosophically about us that is unique, Medplum invites interoperability. We want people to build highly interoperable apps. We want them to make lots of connections. That is distinct from, I think, other systems which are, would like to, in some cases, limit or have limited access along various lines.
Reshma, I love that Medplum uses GraphQL. Tell me about that choice there. Why are you using GraphQL over technologies like REST? And how does this choice sort of enhance flexibility and capability in the platform, especially when you think about the kind of the end user or use case of supporting virtual care or a integrated healthcare ecosystem?
So we do support REST, and we have a Fire API, standard one, all works. We also do support GraphQL. And one of the reasons is, it's back to the ergonomics. Again, this is the ergonomics for developers, though. And if you want to develop an app quickly, you want to be able to express yourself in code quickly, GraphQL is a really good tool. We're, very standards forward, standards compliant on the Medplum side. And so we use a lot of Fire. And Fire has resources, and resources point to other resources, and they can be nesty and twisty. So having a GraphQL interface does reduce the burden for developers and helps them wrangle the data model, which due to the nature of healthcare is complex, in a more effective way. It's surprisingly popular. When we released it, we were kind of shocked at the response to it, but we're really happy that customers are taking to it. And we think that it's going to be a useful development paradigm, help people get their apps out the door quicker and higher quality and better.
We're going to talk a little bit about messaging and customer relationship management and electronic medical records integration. So you have a stance that I completely agree with, which is the power of combining messaging and tasks within the clinical context. We'd love it if you could go a little bit deeper into that and why it's really fundamental to the next generation of healthcare software.
This is part of the original ethos of Medplum, which is we want, composability to be part of what we offer to our customers and community. Composability really helps with getting things to truly work across the board. And that's one of the main tenets of open source software. And also, we see it especially useful for this messaging and CRM case. One of the big use cases for Medplum is, messaging of various types. I think messaging from the user perspective, the patient to provider, provider to provider. And we also support a lot of messaging types from legacy systems like HL7v2 messaging and, communications with DICOM, MLLP, et cetera. This event-driven kind of reach out, get a response is just very foundational, fundamental. And we think that integrated into the clinical context provides just that much more power. I think one of a big, constituencies in the Medplum community are software developers who are building healthcare software. So if you're building, for example, a call center application or a, CRM or patient engagement solution, if you can't access the patient's allergies or you can't get their history of appointments, you're just in a tough spot. That's what we see, the value of that, having that unified model. I think it's controversial in that it's even adding more stuff to a category with a lot of functionality already. But we hope that combined with the headless nature and the ability to customize the UI and the clinical logic, that this will be a compelling use case for people. I think wrapping around versus directly integrating, we support both patterns. I think that it's really a matter of where you come from as an organization and what systems and workflows you have in place. But in general, having access to the data you need at your fingertips, we see as super important.
So if I'm listening to this and I'm looking to either custom build these from scratch or take it off the shelf, what would you say to someone like me?
So there really is no solution that will stand alone off the shelf and work. That's my belief. Almost everything will require some amount of programming. Whether the system you're using was designed to be programmed and whether it supports it natively or you have to kind of force it, that's the difference. Just think about all the crazy workflows. Scribes, automatic responders, bot responders, triage list. The use cases are immense. And for our customers, many of them are replacing a system because they can no longer manipulate it the way they need to. So they want something that's more programmatic. So I guess, Angela, to answer your question, my belief is that there is pretty much no implementation without programming. Whether you do it yourself as an organization or you find someone to do it, that's part of where the industry is. Maybe in the future, this will be solved via LLMs or something, but at present, that's where we are.
You mentioned wrapping a CRM around EMR functionality, and there is a growing trend. I can speak personally as someone who's currently doing things like this. Can you speak to some of the risks and benefits, I think, to this approach? Because I think EMRs are really good at certain things. CRMs are really good at certain things.
Yeah.
And can you speak to why are these MSO models or VBC models struggling to kind of build this?
I mean, you used a couple of terms in there, VBC and MSO, which speak to the complexity of implementing these solutions. For example, if you're doing a managed service offering or a value-based care offering, you're often sewing together multiple practices who have a long history of doing things, their own way. I think that's part of the challenge. You're not really often building de novo. You're bringing in a bunch of providers who have a workflow, and it needs to keep on going. It can't stop. So some of the complexity comes in adjusting your software to the workflow and really understanding it well. That's often a product function, and then building it so that it respects what's in place and doesn't interrupt, is additive versus like messing with anything that's in place. I think the key reason that traditional EHRs struggle is because they're so rigid. They're designed for a few cases, like they have a strong sense of place. They assume that a provider is in a certain location, or they have a strong sense of, fee for service or some kind of specific transaction. And so it's hard to work around those aspects. So the rigidity is a big problem for a lot of the implementations, and why people would look to find alternatives or wrap around in a novel way.
A lot of our listeners are builders and operators in health tech. And so we would love to understand from you, what are some of the common pitfalls that you've seen health tech companies fall into when it comes to scaling their products? And do you have any advice on how we can avoid them?
Ooh, hard one. So, common pitfalls with building and scaling products are really, keeping all the stakeholders aligned and doing great change management. And that is a problem that we've seen time and time again. One of the things that we find incredibly helpful in this regard is to lean on a standard versus make something up. I'll compare and contrast. So some people are building out software to run a large scale multi-state practice, and they spin up a database and they make up their own data model and build up an app that does the functionality that they need. Eventually, they need to bring more people on or more sites on, and people just don't know what the fields mean that they made in their database. So one of the things that we do at Medplum is we have a lot of tooling to help support you if your stuff doesn't fit, but in general, you should use the standard FHIR, HL7v2, LOINC. And if you lean on those standards, then at least it's look-upable by someone else so that they could interpret. This is a big deal for folks who have done implementations, and very helpful. And it also helps prevent against many of the issues that, for example, you have a key personnel, change in your organization. That continuity of business is typically tricky, and you don't know what's gone specifically into an implementation. And use of the standards is just so useful for scaling. A bunch of our community members, customers, a lot of their use cases are sewing together data from multiple systems, and the use of the standards again here is just helping them to a large extent. For those who are doing AI implementations too, all these LLMs understand the standards a lot better than your bespoke data model, so that can also help. I guess that's more on the novel side.
I also find that when you're scaling quickly, there are a lot of demands and a lot of requests coming from all sorts of stakeholders, to your point about stakeholder alignment. And so I'm curious if you all have found a framework for how you do prioritization to make sure that as you're scaling, you're focused on the right things.
We're right back to those abstractions that we talked about at the top of the show. So we are very disciplined about keeping the data, the identities, the event-driven workflows, and the clinical logic separate. So when we get those demands that, we need this workflow to work this way, at least you can, in a more streamlined way, add resources to that project in a way that if you have an alternate pattern, you wouldn't be able to do that. You'd need to you can only have one open heart surgery at a time, but you could add a few Legos in strategic places. I will not say that this is solved, but it does really help to have a platform engineering approach when you have a lot of stakeholders and a lot of people to manage. Many of our community members, for example, are able to effectively use Medplum to staff augment because our documentation and APIs are really good. And so they can parallelize some of their development or some of their use cases that their core staff might have a tricky time supporting. But it is a hard one, and part of the issue with a lot of these healthcare apps is just there's so much functionality that needs to be supported. I think the parallel tracks from open source is what has helped other platforms really thrive, and we think it could be applicable here as well.
Reshma, could you share a few notable Medplum community stories that might resonate?
Sure thing. So first of all, if you go to medplum.com, in the footer of our site, we have some case studies, and folks have kindly made videos of their implementation. So I recommend people check that out. But I think you had some team members from FlexSpa on here before. They have a very cool implementation where they're, pulling from the patient access APIs from the payers. And it's for those of us in interop, I was like, wow, I haven't seen something like that. So it's an emergent use case. This is not at all like an EHR or a care app. It's more of a solution to get data that was previously dark, and it's very, very cool. Yeah, the team at Summer Health has a cool implementation as well. And I think they're very, forward on the AI use cases and have a good solution that is very messaging centric, very patient centric. It's a pediatric care application where you can, via messaging, get care for your child. So, moms in the group are also excited about that one. I think both are cool, and we think, we're excited for the team and hopeful that more implementers will be inspired to build their solutions. I'd say that, we span multiple verticals: healthcare software, care applications, provider-facing, patient-facing, and also in the payer sphere as well.
And can you talk a little bit about how tech-enabled healthcare service companies are using Medplum as a sidecar application and why that may be advantageous for them?
Good. That's a good question as well. So I think some of our community and customers are building full care applications like an electronic health record. And some already have an electronic health record or or maybe a picture archiving system or other clinical application that they're using for their primary workflow. I think part of it, specific commercial models like managed service offering, MSO, value-based care, we've discussed in this previous hour, those need functionality that EHR doesn't readily support often. Things like messaging, advanced interop, or access for partners that's controlled. For example, you want to have a partnership with another clinic. You don't want to share all the patient data, but only some segment. And those type of flexible use cases that are often, need specific access controls, need specific workflows, messaging centric, asynchronous, rely on tasking or other, primitives. Those are really good use cases for Medplum, and we see customers building off of those. And one thing that's kind of interesting from the healthcare IT perspective, Medplum has a Fire G10 interface, which is like a Fire API. And other health records have it too. So there's kind of a very natural peering relationship that other EHRs have. People connect to, Epic and a lot of the major platforms using this technique, plus some other techniques as well. Usually they have to do a combination method, but that natural, touch point is something that is well suited to building a sidecar application.
Thank you, Reshma. Want to just hit lastly before we go into the concept closing call. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for innovation in health tech over the next year or three, and where do you envision Medplum playing in that sphere?
I'm really excited about this question because I think that we're in a great time for health technology and for healthcare built for purpose applications. I think the future is really bright. And the thought that I'll plant in your mind with regards to the way the future is going to go is not like more UIs or more fancy looking apps. It's actually less. I think that headless systems and automations, the advances in AI that are happening will make it so that a lot of stuff that is done by humans, a human workload today, is actually done by machines. And I'm really kind of excited by that prospect. To take the burden off clinicians, to provide a better quality, more access, I think that is really going to be something that we see as a futuristic use case. The idea that a lot of the administrative work too could be could be automated. I'm super hopeful for that. I think we're still in early days, but 1 to 3 years, yeah, we're going to make a lot of progress. And technology advances and stuff are just going to be compounding over that time period.
All right, Reshma, we have arrived at the very exciting portion of the podcast called the Concept Closing Call. So we're going to ask you some questions, and they're just meant to be fun, fast-paced. So the first question is, are there any frameworks, methods, or processes that you've found to be especially helpful in your work?
The first one I'll plug here is source control. If you are... it's a process. I write a lot of documents and I write them in source control, and having that kind of change management for it, I think, is incredibly effective and fun, and can really help organizations. Also, didn't make this up. The founder of GitLab, his name is Sid, wrote their whole handbook, in source control online, and it's like an amazing resource for all founders to see. I think that's very inspiring, and we live that today at Medplum. And I think others might find it useful too. So when you're spinning up a new doc, think about source control.
I think about it with SOPs for the ops teams. When we're writing SOPs, it's like it's an evolving thing, and you want to know who made the change, why we made the change, the metadata associated with the change. And I think source control is great for stuff like that.
And then someone merge it and have feedback, that's useful.
Yeah.
If you're in a heavily regulated industry too, just so many benefits. Anyway, I digress.
Sorry. What is a tool that is highly valuable to you and that you think that others might not be using?
I like to use Claude to generate code and to talk to in general, maybe as a sounding board for even a lot of decisions. So I think I would recommend Claude. I think it's got a lot of use cases for those who are just not even using it in an integrated way, just kind of for a thought buddy.
Are there any concepts in healthcare that are really exciting to you right now?
I mean, this might be a recurring theme, but I think the fact that healthcare regulators are leaning so hard into the open source standards like FHIR, like SNOMED, they're even open sourcing a lot of the quality metrics and the implementations for them. I think that's it's a great trend. There was a kind of maybe 8 or 10 years ago, an initiative that started this in motion, and it's just starting to really become a movement now. And I think that is very exciting. And for those of us who are really in the weeds trying to make the systems work, it's going to be a huge benefit.
Do you think product management is a science or an art?
First of all, it's definitely an art. There's a large belief that technologists are kind of tone deaf to healthcare. They have a lot of just faux pas, or they think very differently. I'd say the art here for product managers is really listening carefully to the requirements and understanding the landscape well. And in that way, I think art plays a big part. We at Medplum are not immune from this. We also have to work really hard on it to try and stay in tune with what's needed versus the right technological solution.
And where can people get in touch with you if they want to reach out? And would also welcome any shameless plugs that you have. Maybe I can give one for you, which is to add to their community.
Would so appreciate that. There are 3 major ways to reach us. First of all, github.com/Medplum. Medplum is our core repository. Join us there. If you have a GitHub account, star the repo. That is my plug. I am Reshma at medplum.com. Would welcome emails. Would love to talk to anybody who's into the weeds as much as we are. And, we have our website, medplum.com. In the footer, there's a Discord community, which would love to have folks join, as well as various, YouTube and stuff like that, if you're into watching healthcare IT YouTube shorts. So all of those, we would love to have people in. Thank you for letting me plug those.
Reshma, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a delight. You are the first CEO we've had on the show. You're an engineer by training, and I think, you have builder DNA. You've been a founder, multi-time founder. And so, this has just been an incredible episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show. If you liked this episode, don't forget to leave us a rating and a review on your podcast app of choice. And make sure to click the follow button so you never miss a new episode. This episode was produced and edited by Marvin Yue with research help from Aditya Treya. We're Angela and Omar, and you've been listening to Concept to Care.